Hello everybody, it's Richard and Jane again from Medusa Games with our Sunday night streams. We said at the end of last week, the Oranges and Lemons game, that we'd be doing some racing in flying machines today. Slight change of plan, we're not actually going to go through a race itself today. Instead we're going to explain the idea of what we're going to do. So it's one of those things that actually in the early days, and I still think it's one of the most amazing things, almost as soon as people had managed to get into the air for 90 seconds without crashing, there were all of these international air races going on all over the place. So I think we've got some posters here from the time. So as you can see from there, meeting in Nice, Heliopolis, first aviation meeting in England, Brussels 1910, it's so early. The first aviation meeting in England is actually in Doncaster, which isn't an obvious place, but there you go. And we've got German ones down there as well. And I think that's an Italian one, is it? Bottom left?
Yes, Bocconi, Italy, yeah.
Yeah. So it really was a thing that went international and long distance almost immediately.
Yeah, yes. And these posters, by the way, are on display at the Shuttleworth Air Museum, not far from London. There's a whole set of vintage planes from the time period, as well as all these posters and things. So
and that's just a selection. There were a lot more air races than that.
So an awful lot of air races, and actually they sort of obviously had to take a pause when the First World War came along. But there was this huge amount of interest in aviation at the time, and all of these air races. So that was actually the original inspiration for our game, Magnificent Fly Machines. But we've also been thinking of late how to start to think about putting together a few variations to the game to allow the recreation of some of these air races, either hypothetical air races or even potentially historical air races.
So as those of you who've got a copy of Flying Machines or have looked on the sort of full version on Tabletopia will know, for the standard game, you only need a certain number of terrain tiles, but there's an extra 3 in the box.
Yes.
And what's the purpose of those? It's not particularly to run an extra long race. You can put them all out at once, but then you tend to run a bit low on resources depending how many players you've got in the game and so on. But it's really more to give variety. So we've got these different types of terrain, and you can obviously have a very different type of game if you've got lots of water or if you've got no water or whatever. So the standard rules are all about putting in a setup where there's an equal spread of terrain and everyone's got an equal chance to do everything. But of course the planet isn't actually designed that way, and flying from anywhere to anywhere else, you're not going to get a nice equal spread of terrain normally.
No. So the standard set layout has a field and a town and a water space and a mountain between each of the airfields, and then a suggestion for randomised setups as well. But now we've been thinking a bit about some slightly more some air courses based upon actual geography, if you like, not necessarily specific air races that happen. That might be something that we do come back to, but this is more just looking at a particular geography and having a thought about how you might do an air race around that and then replicating it. So
and it's one of those things that down the line we might actually get round to producing a proper expansion with actual sea or tundra or other terrain types beyond what we've got.
And different weather conditions as well is something we've thought about. Anyway, let's have a look at one or two of these. So this is an idea for an air race from Athens to Budapest, and the idea is, of course, that Greece is very, very mountainous. So you start off, the first airfield is at Athens, but then in the middle of the mountains you've got this field area, which I thought we'd put in as an olive grove. The idea being that you sort of that you're now going to do a cargo run of olives to Budapest. And we say with these early air races, there are all sorts of strange ideas about what you got points for. So the idea of this race is that everyone can land and grab a cargo of olives, and then try and get it to Budapest. So in this thing, we've got mountains, fields, mountains. So that's going to be a pretty sort of hairy start to the race to get across three mountain spaces. and then the idea is that you can land, and then you've got the River Danube to deal with, and then the Hungarian plains, and finally the city of Budapest, where you can try and land and give those olives over for the final airfield.
So in that sort of setup then, certainly compared to the standard setup, if you're taking on passengers,
yes,
then you've got the whole of that second half where there's nowhere to drop them off.
Until you get down, yes.
And indeed, as well, with all those mountains in the first half, if you do crash land a couple of times, there aren't many resources available there, so you're going to struggle a bit to actually get through.
These obviously are designed to be a little bit more of a challenge. In addition, what we've actually done is to look a little bit at the weather. Now, if we did do one day in expansion with extra terrain and different types of weathering, that would allow to being able to sort of manipulate the balance of the weather tiles by adding more in. But we think you can still do this with what we've got. So these are the weather tiles as exist at the moment. There are, in the actual game, there are 6 sunny ones, 5 of the cloudy weather, 4 windy, 4 snow, 3 fog, and 2 lightning storms. And what we're suggesting here is this is Greece, so nice and sunny. What I've actually done is to take out some of the fog and the snow and the lightning storms. So actually, the weather in this particular race would actually be fairly not too bad, proportionally.
But that's also important because with all those mountain terrains in the first half of this race, when we were originally playtesting the game, we had at one point what we call the Valley of Death, where there was a mountain square followed by a water square, and if you got a lightning storm over the top of it, because in the early versions of the game the weather didn't move between turns, it was just there, and nobody could get through because they'd crash and then they couldn't get off the ground again. So 3 lots of mountains is tough enough. With that, you don't need the bad weather as well.
And I've suggested in this one that the Danube, being quite wide, is an extra one to take off or land there. And in addition, though, there are bonus points for everybody who lands there, not only the first player. Okay, so that's the idea of this sort of Athens to Budapest race. Then I can find the next one. See if there we go. There's a little thing. This is Geneva to Milan. So you start off in the airfield. You fly over Geneva and across Lake Geneva, and then you're into the Alps, of course. So now we've got mountains again, but with an airfield in the middle, and then you've got the Italian lakes, and then the plains of northern Italy, and the city of Milan. And what I've done with this one, in terms of the variation, apart from the terrain there, I've suggested that, again, with the weather conditions, I've said, well, going across the Alps, you've probably not got as much, it isn't as sunny. So by taking out the amount of the sun and also a couple of foggy ones, proportionally you're more likely to get more snow and other windy conditions and lightning and things. So again, that'll be quite a difficult potentially crossing of the Alps.
And the middle airfield's actually harder than normal to land on.
Yes, I should say landing difficulty here. Add 2 to take off and landing in the middle airfield, because I'm imagining an airfield in the middle of the Alps where you've got to come down from a height and land on it and then take off steeply.
Rather painful. Even today, those airfields that have got those sort of very sharp turns in can be quite unpleasant to actually go to.
Okay, so that is Geneva to Milan. So we get London to Paris. So what I've done with London to Paris is you take off just outside London, go across Kent, and then you've got the Channel to contend with. So what we've said here is that the middle water space is actually considered to be open sea, and taking off and landing there is actually 6s that you require, and flying over it is a 3 because it's obviously pretty windy in the middle of the sea. But you score 6 points for being the first to land if you can somehow manage to land there. And again, imagining that there were these experimental things like
the seaplane, obviously, and the
there's
floats.
Obviously, the seaplane with the floats can help, but even ordinary planes, what they did often was to use merchant vessels, which you could land on the decks of or take off from, and they were experimenting with that at this time period. And certainly that came in the First World War and things, as sort of like the ancestors of what became aircraft carriers later. But if you fail or catastrophically fail the takeoff and landing in the sea, I've suggested that you actually towed back to the previous water space, which is like Dover, and now you've got to have another go to get across the sea.
Almost like a golf course. So you've got the water hazard, so you've got to go back to the where you first thought of.
So now we've moderated the weather a little bit to make it less sunny. This is starting off from Britain after all, so not quite as sunny. But most of them are the fairly standard ones with, and I've taken out a bit of snow as well.
Yeah. Because the original weather was really thought of with the Round Britain race in mind, wasn't it?
Yes, that's right. But a little bit less sort of sunny, a little bit of snow in there. But that's the London to.
And then once
London
you manage to cross
race.
the channel, the second half of the race is pretty straightforward there with just fields and.
Yeah, so then the idea is you're landing here. This is presumably going to be Calais, and then you off across the sort of northern France is pretty flat, and then you've got Paris itself, which I've got two town spaces in a row there, and then finally the airfield. Now, in fact there was. Movie, the Magnificent Men and Their Flying Machines, had a London to Paris air race. Now, in fact, of course, there wasn't such a London to Paris air race in this time period. What they were basing it on were the other air races, which included things like the Round Britain race, which is the one that's closest to what we see in that movie, with all the international participants and all of this sort of thing going on. But of course, ultimately, you get people flying across the channel and ultimately, of course, the Atlantic. So that's London to Paris, and I think the idea of if we ever did get around to this doing something like this in a sort of more formal way, then I think things like the idea we're going to have probably is to have an actual
sea terrain
tiles and things with a sort of an actual complete sea one and then a coastal parts to it, and you can imagine the White Cliffs of Dover being sort of a bit difficult because they're quite tall and things. You've got to get up and over the top of them and things. So I think there could be something to go with there. And what we haven't got in our sort of terrain makeup on this particular game, of course, is anything in terms of woods or forests either. And so I was looking at things like the Ardennes and
but we really don't have, and obviously we don't have desert, and we don't have. We don't have tundra either.
Yeah. Okay. And let's go to the last one that I've got on of these four here. I don't want to restart now. Thanks very much, Mr. Computer. Okay. So Venice, Monaco, Milan. So the idea of this is starting off at Venice. You go over the canals, or the Grand Canal or whatever. Then you've got the North Italian sort of plains, and I've actually chosen the couple of field tiles here, which are the ones that have more stuff on them, because the North Italian plains are sort of meant to be pretty fertile, and Napoleon sort of told them as being the sort of wealthiest or the those fertile plains in the world or something.
And of course, the history of Italy, all those little city-states, there are lots of small towns and cities across there as well.
That's right. So then you get to Monaco here, and I've actually made that a checkpoint in this, so you have to land at the town. You can't just land at the airfield,
because in a normal game, although you have to get past the middle airfield in order for it to be a complete game, everyone has to have got past that point. It's not necessary for everyone to land, and quite often if you're the last person you might not bother landing.
Not to bother, no. But we've done something where there's four additional points for the first and second to land in Monaco, as well as everyone having to actually check in there. And then on the other side of that we've got water space, which I've basically made the Camargue, which is the these big waterlands are sort of sat in South France, where we once broke down.
Yes, your father's famous comment about we'd just broken down. We'd called the AA. We were talking about it, and then he said, "Well, have we stopped moving?" And everyone else just laughed.
Had a flat tire, didn't we? It took a while to sort that one out. Right, and then you go across the Pyrenees, and then across the Spanish sort of plains, and finally end up in Madrid. And obviously the weather here, I've made it obviously very sunny, but I've taken out basically made the lightning storms and the fog and things and the snow a lot less likely to likely to occur. So the idea here is that by mucking about with the standard layout that you've got and this obviously just uses a standard length game. I've not gone with a longer thing. We've just gone with the standard length game. But you can have different sorts of situations, and I'm thinking about another one being a race between sort of. Maybe there actually been 3 towns on the course as well as the airfield, so it's all about. And that was a thing that did happen with some of these air races. There was races for sort of Paris to Liège to Brussels and things.
You had to check in at each place, as it were.
You had to check in, and the Round Britain race, for that matter, was different towns and things that you had to land at. So that's that idea. And the reason we're sort of we're looking at this is, as we alluded to last week, we're looking at doing a great sort of a world sort of air race championship, as it were, with all the pilots.
Yeah. Yep. So not around the world, because obviously we don't have things in the box. We don't have terrain for other parts of the world. This was definitely with sort of Europe in mind when we first prepared it. But there are pilots in there from everywhere.
Yes.
And so what we're going to do is we're going to have a series of 4 heats, and those will probably be over these differential terrains that we've got here.
Yeah.
And in each of the 4 heats we'll have 4 different pilots.
Yes.
So in the quick start version of the game there were 6 pilots that you used to begin with, and obviously because those are there, those are the ones that we know best and that other people tend to know best. But there's all sorts of different pilots with exciting different things that they can do. So the plan is that we'll have a race. It'll just be a shorter sort of 1 hour session.
Yeah.
We'll each pick a pilot and then pick a flying machine and equip it.
Yes.
And then we will set off on one of these courses, and we will probably add a time element into it as well. The one where everyone has to take the olives to the end, I mean, that's obviously something where somebody's got to get to the end probably in order for that one to finish. All of the others, providing you're past the middle airfield, you could just score up along the way. So it'll probably be an hour of playing time, and then who's got to that position by then.
Limited over cricket game, basically. A sort of it'll be a finite amount of time, and actually we'll do the build of the planes and the things before we go live, but then we'll explain what everyone's chosen. And when you're looking now at some of these airfields and things, I mean, thinking about let's have a look at them. We've got are they gone now? The
Athens one.
Athens ones, it's obviously there's not much water there, so the waterplane, the seaplane, and the floats and things are not going to be much use there. But the weather conditions aren't too bad, but the mountains obviously are a bit of a challenge.
So there's 2 things that immediately occur to me with that one. One is that in order to get the olives to the end, you need to actually get to the end. So a monoplane might be quite handy from the point of view of wanting to actually belt to the end of the course, more so than you would in a normal game. And the other thing is all those mountains, the helicopter would be looking good, not from the point of view of belting across, but just from the point of view of being able to land and take off, because of course the helicopter, the terrain it ignores, it can never get more difficult than a 2.
Yes.
So that would have a big advantage as well in that particular one.
Right, in the case of Geneva to Milan, the weather conditions here are worse, are quite bad. So now you're thinking about one pilot that would be good, I think, is the chap that's Nepalese one, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, the navigator.
And also with the goggles, both. So things that improve, that can help mitigate to some extent the weather conditions.
And of course, don't forget the ability to have the chap who can have an extra card throughout.
Yeah. Or re-rolls the dice, or more difficult situations are going to be important as well. And it might be that it depends on what strategy you've got. Since we're going to do this as a finite time length, you know, the actual, we're actually only going to probably play for sort of 50 minutes once we explain where we are and why we've chosen things. The games normally, you know, I've played 3-player games of this in about 45 minutes to an hour, but normally it's more like an hour to an hour and a half, isn't it? So we're not necessarily going to get everyone to the end of the course. So then the question is, do you go for trying to get the points from the first to lands and the cargoes along the way, or do you go with the monoplane and try and actually race down the course and grab those things? This particular Geneva to Milan, the first to land spaces are worth 5 points on each of those mountains.
In the mountains, yeah. So again, the helicopter might be a good choice, but you've got enough water to make the seaplane.
Yes, now
viable
three water things. I think that starts to look quite a possible. At a certain extent, it might depend on what you end up with cargo at the start, of course, because you get either a mountain cargo or a water cargo, and that would if you had a water cargo, a seaplane, or perhaps the floats are starting to look quite sort of tempting on that one.
London to Paris now.
Yeah.
Here, the seaplane and the floats clearly
Yes.
very much.
Yes.
Or the monoplane, just because it's so good at flying, it could just
gets across.
Go straight across,
Don't worry
yeah.
too much about it, sort of thing. And but the extra points for landing in the sea are tempting, aren't they? 6 points there. So that might be.
I don't think I'd be landing if I was in the monoplane unless
I
I managed to get the floats.
That's why you would take the seaplane, wouldn't you, in this situation, or the floats with your monoplane.
But of course there'll be 4 pilots, so they can't all do that.
No, we can't order that. So we'll have to see what the combinations and things. Venice to Monaco to Milan. You know, at first glance, this one doesn't look too difficult, does it, really? Because the first half is relatively easy to fly across. The mountains come towards the end.
Yep.
You know, you have to stop at this town here, and there are points for doing that. You know, I think this one is probably the slightly more easy one, especially with the weather conditions being that there's not that much chance of snow or lightning storms or anything like that.
Of course, the Camargue water space is harder than an ordinary water space, so there's that to consider. But equally, because it's straight off to the airfield, then a lot of the time you might just, you know, if you're fully equipped beforehand, just take off and just miss that one out completely. Just carry on.
If you had a water cargo to deliver, or you picked one up, then obviously you would
have to.
You might have to be thinking about that, unless you decide you want to stop at the very first space. But then that means doing a landing quite early on, and other people might race on past you. So
I think I'd be inclined to actually get rid of it rather than have to face the Camargue one.
Yes.
And then, of course, the mountains come towards the end. So, given that in the average game, the first few terrain tiles, you've got all your equipment and all your boosts and whatever, but it's towards the end that you're struggling a bit. Having all those mountains at the back end of the race.
Yeah, that could be quite a challenge to get over that. And it might be one where you're thinking, okay, well, let's just get most of my points in the first part of the game and things, and then if I don't get over those mountains at the end. Let's not worry too much about it. And think about it as well, there's only one town here. Well, there's the airfield and things, but once you get past the middle airfield, there's no town until the very last space, so you can't drop off passengers. So normally grabbing passengers on the middle airfield is a thing you're going to want to do, isn't it? I
mean, if I was the first there and I was in a monoplane, I might do that anyway, because I'd be thinking I'm just going to run hell for leather for home at that point. Yes.
Well, I see Millie's popped on, hello Millie. There we go. So that's the idea then. The idea of this is that with Helen and James, who have been playing with us the last few weeks, of course, with the Oranges and Lemons playtest that we've been doing, they'll join us again, and we'll each do a pilot each, and then what I was going to do is we'll score depending on where we'll have our personal scores that we'll carry on through. So we'll find out which one of us has done the best over these 5 races individually.
But in terms of the pilots, it'll be the winning pilot from each race who will actually end up in the final. In the final, depending if Richard here, with his vast extra knowledge compared to the rest of us, ends up having 3 out of the 4 winning pilots, he obviously can't fly all 3 in the final one.
We each have 1 pilot each and things. I think what we'd probably do is we'd probably make it that the points and things that you got determine choosing first in the final race. But I'm thinking, yes, there's all sorts of possibilities for other terrain, which could be quite fun. The good thing about when you're designing board games and things, one thing that you have to think about is how easy is it to do expansion. So one of the controlling factors in that is, have you got the tools, as it were, which by that I mean the manufacturers of the games. When they make the games themselves, they have to punch out these things from the boards or the card or whatever they're using, and that requires certain shaped tools, literally presses and things that they punch the things with. Now if those tools exist already, there's a certain cost to them, then you can reuse them potentially, and so these tile things would be fairly easy to do a sheet or two with different sorts of terrain on, because all you're doing then is just changing around the artwork and things.
Obviously, so the Great Fire expansion was just a pack of cards.
Yeah.
So that's easy. The first of the Nine Worlds ones was also just a pack of cards. Was the Creatures and Monsters that we're working on. That's much more complicated.
Yes.
And that will be something that will require separate tooling and whatever, but it's adding a whole different dimension. So yes, we're when the world gets a little bit more back to normal, we might think about having a formal expansion and adding in some of these other things. But in the meantime, these are just some suggestions, and obviously you can play around yourselves as well. So if you've got the game, you've got all the bits, or if you go on Tabletopia, again, we've got all the bits there, and you can have a play around and see. So Helen and James were supposed to be with us today. Unfortunately, they couldn't be, as somebody helped themselves to both of their laptops, which is not good.
How is it typical? You get a burglary during lockdown. How unlucky is that? I mean, hardly ever out the house, are you? and James is a teacher, and he's basically on furlough effectively at the moment, isn't he, and not doing much. So he's almost in all the time. They go out to buy some popcorn, was it?
And get some light bulbs and
some light bulbs. And a brief half an hour that they're down the road at the shop, they get a burglary, which is most unfortunate. Hopefully by next week they'll have got themselves equipped again with the laptops and so on, and we can they can join us, and we'll do the first of these races. That's the plan for the next sort of 4 or 5 weeks. Is the Great World Championship of air races. These 4 courses, and we'll be coming up with something special for the fifth course, the final race, which I'm sure will be quite difficult. So it should be fun. So hopefully you'll join us then.
Okay, so that's all from us for today. Hope you all have a good week, and we'll see you next Sunday.
Okay, goodbye.
Bye.